Hello, fifth grade. Today we're going to continue going more into depth about how slavery continued and how it kind of more or less started to come into the mainland. Today we're going to talk about West Africa and the slave trade and what exactly happened when they were taken from ship or taken from the mainland. We talked about how they were taken in our last lesson and how it kind of started. Today we're going to talk about the journey coming to the Americas. So we're going to talk about the actual slave trade process and of course the Middle Passage. And I found some little research to hear some excerpts from conditions of what really was the Middle Passage, if you've heard of it before, and kind of really, hopefully, in your mind you could understand the horrors of it. But it continued for hundreds of years, or for at least 100 years, and then we'll talk a little bit how it kind of stopped. All right, so if you have your packet first, we're going to go over some vocabulary, and then after vocabulary, we're going to read sections 3 and go over the illustration for section 3, and then I will read the triangular trade, or section 4, and go over the picture for section 4. So we're going to do section 3 and section 4 today. All right, so let's start with vocabulary. Our first vocab word is, the word we got last lesson was slave trade. So slave trade was the business of capturing, transporting, and selling people as slaves in exchange for goods. And today we're going to talk about the triangular trade and the Middle Passage. So the triangular trade was the exchange of slaves and goods between Europe, the Americas, and West Africa, using shipping routes across the Atlantic Ocean. The Middle Passage was the voyage of a slave ship across the Atlantic Ocean from West Africa to the West Indies in the American continent. So you have to think the triangle from Europe to Africa to the Indies, the Americas, and then back to Europe. And then the Middle Passage being the Africa to Americas route, and that being, be sharing the examples of how slaves experienced it, and then how it was interpreted by their captives, trying to promote it, and then those who were abolitionists who were trying to fight it. Okay, so we're gonna, if you want to pause it, make sure you get those vocab words, and now we're gonna read about the West African slave trade. And while we're reading, we're gonna pay attention to 3 ways in which Africans responded to the European slave trade. So we're gonna try to find, obviously they're being captives and taken without their will, so we want to find 3 examples of their response. The West Africans and the slave trade. The people of West Africa had many different opinions about slave trade with Europeans. Some believed that the slave trade was bad and it didn't take part in it, while others enjoyed the riches that it brought. The people of West Africa had to make a choice about slave trade, which had impacts on different parts of West Africa and its people. Remember that if they traded, they received guns and metals and all these other items that they saw as desirables. So that's how one way was promoted within the different groups and villages within Africa. A few West Africans refused to take part in the slave trade, but it was hard to resist the Europeans. One West African king tried and said he would not permit enslaved people to be moved through his country. The Europeans tried to bribe him, but the king still refused. Then the Europeans convinced a rival group of West Africans to go to war against him. Many of the king's people were captured and enslaved themselves. So, what's one way Africans responded to European slave traders? Well, the first part is to be refused to take part in it, and while others helped to enable it, right? Other West Africans tried to find slaves outside their nations. Sometimes a king made war against his neighbors. He sold the people he captured to the slave traders, so kind of like in this example from the previous paragraph. More often, however, a group of one West African village would raid another village. Armed with guns, the raiders would capture men, women, and children. Sometimes they would kidnap the children while the adults were not around. Some West African groups did not raid other villages. Instead, they traded people who were already enslaved, such as prisoners they had captured during previous wars. These groups often did not want to be part of the slave trade, but they had little choice. Their neighbors who did trade slaves were becoming richer and more powerful, and might soon try to capture and sell them as slaves. Remember, from previous lessons. What does it all come down to? It all comes down to money. So it all came down to money. So if one group was going to be becoming richer by getting guns and having that extra power over another village by having the weapons, the other groups are going to try to follow suit as well, you know, kind of keeping up with the Joneses. So the as the colloquialism goes. All right, so let's think about what are the 3 ways in which Africans responded to slave traders. So we're going to go back up to the top. And in our packet, we have the first example, which was to refuse to take part in the slave trade. So what we got from our reading, they refused to take part in the slave trade. Groups would capture or go to war with neighboring villages trading captured Africans. They would have village raids and capture children, or they would trade already enslaved Africans from crimes that they had enslaved people as punishment or from wars. So you want to pause it and write down, it says 3, but obviously there are more listed in the reading. So next, the picture that's on the next page obviously is a bad example from the copying, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on my screen, and what I want you to do is to find at least 5 specific details and then find a phrase or sentence from the text that connects to something in this image. So go back to the reading and find something that connects to the image. And the image I could kind of blow up a little bit here, make this a little bit bigger. And so if we look, see there is a group walking across. There's some to be in horseback, probably holding a spear or a staff. It looks like it's probably not an easy terrain to walk through. Obviously, we have tattered clothes. We have them tied together and chained. Looks like we have mainly men and women, hands bound. And we can assume from the reading that this was probably maybe a village raid. It says one group of West African village would raid another village. Armed with guns, the raiders would capture men, women, and children. Sometimes they would kidnap the children while the adults were not around. So in this one, we could assume maybe that this was like a village raid. You know, if this group is having horses and weapons, we obviously know that the horses were supplied from Europeans for them to use for their raids to travel through land. Also, similar to this picture, I found a few other images to share. So, and this example is an image that's more or less, I think, kind of depicts the same, it's the same idea, but at least gives you another reference point. And this one you have children also bound, whether, and it was interesting, you see women bound and carrying items. You also see, you know, again, guns, more fully clothed than the other counterparts. They have a hat on. This person is whipping the people as they walk. You see 2 women bound with infants attached to them, as well as children tied. These were called neck yokes. So there was one way they were able to capture people, you know, beyond being tied. Looks like, you know, however they're attached to one another and tied up, they also had these wooden yokes that would refuse them from running away because they were tied to someone else who was then tied to someone else. So obviously families were kidnapped from villages. This image is also very similar, just kind of maybe in a different angle, shows something different. You can see the group that probably did raid, more clothes, they have additional weapons, guns, compared to the villages that they're raiding. Again, women with children carrying, you know, baskets or foods with them. Again, men attached with these neck yokes, also tied. Looks like he's attached to the leader of the group here. It looks like here's one person that had a neck yoke on, still attached, and this one looks like he's about to probably someone to try to run away. So also you probably going to try to hurt him or end his life or punishment for trying to run away. Looks like he's holding this person's gun. He has a gun here and a gun here. So images that you could at least find details to write about, but more or less you see the grim and very savage way they were captured. But when you think of it also, one group is thinking that, well, if they're not capturing my village and we have more power, we will continue to kind of show our dominance over the other villages. So also put, Africans against each other. Could be the same as having like one state battle another state. All right, so those are your examples. So your own details, I'm not going to put a detail here, but a phrase from the text that I think could probably be the most fitting. So we could say Europeans bribed and convinced rival groups of West Africans to go against neighboring groups. All right, let me find the example in the text. So 2 sentences from the text would be West Africans tried to find slaves outside their own nation, and armed with guns, the raiders would capture men, women, and children, right? Just kind of a point to summarize what happened. All right, let's go to the next section of our reading, which is on the triangular trade. And the triangular trade, I'll do the reading and then we'll go over the pictures and the questions from the text. So the triangular trade. People who were captured as slaves faced a terrible journey. First, other West Africans put them in chains and marched them sometimes hundreds of miles to West Africa's west coast. Many slaves died along the way after reaching the coast. European ships waited to load survivors onto slave ships. Many of the enslaved Africans had never seen white people before. None of the slaves knew where they were going or what could happen to them on their voyage to the Americas. The voyage was part of the triangular trade. There were 3 different parts of the triangular trade. In the first part of the triangular trade, Europeans traded cloth, guns, and other goods for slaves from Africa. And we saw that in the picture, right? Some of the Africans were more heavily clothed than the others. Slaves then were sent on a voyage across the Atlantic Ocean that was called the Middle Passage. Because it was the second of 3 parts of the slave trade, the Middle Passage usually took between 21 to 90 days. In bad weather, it could take even longer. Traders sold slaves in South America, the West Indies, and the British colonies in North America. No one knows exactly how many West Africans made the Middle Passage, but the number has been estimated at 10 to 12 million. About 15 out of every 100 Africans died during the voyage because of harsh conditions, and we'll read about that after this. Once they had reached the Americas, most slaves were sent to the West Indies, where slaves grew sugarcane. It was turned into sugar and molasses. New Englanders brought these products and made them into rum. In the third part of the triangular trade, traders took American goods, such as tobacco and sugar, to Europe. They then took goods made in Europe to Africa. There they traded the goods for more slaves. The triangular trade continued for about 300 years. So here's the image of the triangular trade. So if you want to go to the next page in your packet, and it says what continents are shown in the map. Now the continents are clearly written, right? What are our continents? Well, there are 7 continents. We have North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. So we have 4 of our continents mentioned here. So we're going to put those on our page. And then what do the arrows mean? So we did the continents. Now, what do the arrows mean? So the arrows means the directions in which products are exchanged, and the color signifies which continent the products came from, right? So if we look at the orange, all the orange are things that are coming from North America, all the resources that are coming from North America. And the purple signifies everything coming from the West Indies, so the Caribbean, right? You had slaves, sugar, and molasses going to the colonies, and you had slaves going to the southern colonies. Or I'm sorry, slaves, sugar, and molasses were going to the northern colonies. And you saw everything going to the from the Americas. Yellow signifies things that are manufactured and made in Europe. So Europe takes all of these amazing natural resources. Remember, Europe didn't have many natural resources. So that's why it used a lot of its colonies to take their natural resources, make them into goods in Europe, and then they traded those luxuries, so to speak. And then from Africa, we got gold, ivory, spices, and hardwoods, which kind of went more or less back up to Europe to be manufactured. And the slaves were brought to the West Indies. They were traded there and exchanged. Some slaves went there, and then slaves went from the West Indies to the colonies in America. So on our paper, we have how do you think the map might be related to slavery? Is the last question we have to answer. So what does the map show slavery? It shows how slaves were taken from Africa and exchanged between the West Indies and the Americas. Right there. All right, and if you notice, all the other things that are on here are all items, right? They're all resources or goods. So it's important to note that the way slavery interacts in this triangular trade is that it's not just showing where they went, but it's showing that they were seen as a product, okay? So we have to remember, slaves were people that were kidnapped and taken against their will. But through the triangular trade process, and one reason why it proliferated or was continued for so long was because it was considered as a product or a commodity, like, right? It was a resource. Some people got wealthy off of it, just like you get wealthy off of a tobacco plantation or oil or sugar or cotton. It was a product. So it's important to see that one reason why slavery and the people who were for slavery between the 17th century and the 16th century was because they took away the human aspect of it and saw it as a product to make money off of. And by doing that, it allowed it to proliferate for hundreds of years. All right, so let's go to our questions on the next page. I put marker on my map, by the way. You don't need to, but I can't do anything without colors. So this is going to be a little hard to see. My apologies. I didn't think about that prior to. So circle the Atlantic Ocean on the map, right? Here is the Atlantic Ocean. List 5 words or phrases that describe the Middle Passage. Explain the triangular trade between Europe, West Africa, and the Americas. I think I'm going to jump to this question first, just because this, we just answered it on the previous page. It was kind of more or less the same question. All right, 1 second. All right, so our next part on the triangular trade is highlighting the Atlantic Ocean, right? And then it says, what are some words or phrases that describe the Middle Passage? So I just took this from the second and third paragraph from the reading of the triangular trade, right? It was about 3 to 4 months. They said 21 days, but like to get across the ocean took many months. And for a long part, once they were captive and put on the boat, they didn't just like load up a boat and go. Sometimes they would go from one port in West Africa, grab some slaves, some captured Africans, then travel further down the coast to another port and captured. So the Africans on the ship were actually on there for a much longer time. It's not like they were all just, a couple 500 Africans were just captured all at once and thrown onto a ship. They were captured in increments along the coast, and then the whole ship, once it was full, went across the ocean. So being on the ship was on the ship for much longer. So 10 to 12 million slaves traveled the Middle Passage, and I want to say the number is probably higher towards the 12 million. Most readings and research you do will show that it's more on the higher number. But again, it's hard to say how many, from the ones they count. Do they really count? Do they really count how many died on the voyage? There were very harsh conditions, and many Africans died on the voyage. And the next section is surviving the Middle Passage. So we're actually going to do surviving the Middle Passage and slavery in the colonies in our next lesson. But to get an idea of just what the Middle Passage was, I wanted just to highlight a little bit of that. So if you want to pause it. Oh, and I forgot the last part, sorry. Explain the triangular trade between Europe, West Africa, and the Americas. So that's what we already discussed in the previous picture. So from the reading broke it up into 3 pieces, right? The first part was Europeans traded cloth, guns, and other goods for slaves from Africa. The second part was the Middle Passage. Traders sold slaves to the West Indies, South America, and the British colonies. And the third part were American goods were brought to Europe. All right, and we'll do section 5 and 6 in our next lesson. But to talk a little bit about the Middle Passage and how it was able to continue, the Abolition Project was this group, it's actually a European, a Britain actually group that helped to end slavery. And so it's this a lot of documentation and research. So one thing I liked about it were there are excerpts from readings and information gathered during that time period and kind of put together as this like narrative on this webpage. So a lot of great information on here. And it kind of showed both sides, like how, you know, obviously the horrible things about slavery, but the reason why it continued was because there were people in Parliament and in the British who were influencing the king to let it continue through when the colonies were more established. All right, so here is an excerpt from a captive slave who actually wrote a memoir, Equiano Olaudah Equiano. I always kind of mess up on his name and to check the pronunciation. And he actually has a memoir book of being captive and how he get his freedom. I mean, as you get older, I didn't read it until I was in college, but just because a lot of it's written in Old English hand, so it's kind of hard to understand. But this is his description of the Middle Passage and surviving it. So give me a quick minute.
At last, when the ship we were in had gotten all her cargo, they made ready with many fearful noises, and we were all put on the deck so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. But this disappointment was the least of my sorrow. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers.
All right, so I know it's kind of hard to kind of understand, but what they're saying, or what he was saying, is that it was so gross underneath the hold of the ship. They were kind of laid in shelves to kind of like maximize occupancy. So imagine a shelf that's no higher than like, you know, like a bookshelf that's maybe like, I think they said that like 2.5 feet was kind of like how tall it is. And they were laid in those shelves, and they didn't have enough room to even turn over. And so imagine hundreds and hundreds of bodies. They're on the coast of Africa, so it's not like it's, you know, this calm, cool climate. I mean, it's hot, burning, they're out on sea, and so because they're all sweating because they're hot and they're just laying down, there's no room to move, so, you know, there's no room to go to the bathroom or any of those things. They're cramped, and so it becomes hard to even breathe, on top of adding body odor smells that you couldn't even, there was no fresh air to breathe under the hold, that people eventually just got so sick and they died because of the sicknesses they got from living in those conditions for months on end. All right, and so another excerpt was, this is very interesting. It's from, they kind of had there was eventually, you know, deliberations at the British Parliament investigating the conditions, and there were different people who explained that, oh, you know, the slaves are treated very well, the slave ship isn't bad. And so here's an excerpt of a gentleman who's explaining how the slaves were treated. And it's, I mean, almost sounds like I'd like to be treated in a, I wouldn't like to be treated that way, but the way he explains it, he makes it seem like they're on vacation.
Their apartments are fitted up as much for their advantage as circumstances will admit. The right ankle of one, indeed, is connected with the left ankle of another by a small iron fetter, and if they are turbulent, by another on their wrists. They have several meals a day, some of their own country provisions, with the best sauces of African cookery, and by way of variety, another meal of pulse, according to European taste. After breakfast, they have water to wash themselves, while their apartments are perfumed with frankincense and lime juice. Before dinner, they are amused after the manner of their country. The song and dance are promoted. The men play and sing, while the women and girls make fanciful ornaments with beads, which they are plentifully supplied with.
I mean, hardly talking about a slavehold ship, right? And so here is the rebuttal of that speech, which is this other gentleman who talks about showing that the slaves aren't treated in that way. So he kind of counters what this person was saying, right? Like, no, they aren't given perfumes. They aren't allowed to dance. They're hardly given any food. So this is the next excerpt.
Having now disposed of the first part of this subject, I must speak of the transit of the slaves in the West Indies. This, I confess, in my own opinion, is the most wretched part of the whole subject. So much misery condensed in so little room is more than the human imagination had ever before conceived. I verily believe, therefore, if the wretchedness of any one of the many hundred Negroes stowed in each ship could be brought before their view and remain within the sight of the African merchant, that there is no one among them whose heart would bear it. Let any one imagine to himself 600 or 700 of these wretches chained 2 and 2, surrounded with every object that is nauseous and disgusting, diseased and struggling under every kind of wretchedness. How can we bear to think of such a scene as this?
All right. So that was one example of them saying that, someone saying that it wasn't a good thing. And here is the other excerpt of that speech.
The slaves, who are sometimes described as rejoicing at their captivity, are so wrung with misery at leaving their country that it is the constant practice to set sail at night, lest they should be sensible of their departure. The pulse, which Mr. Norris talks of, are horse beans. And the scantiness, both of water and provision, was suggested by the very legislature of Jamaica in the report of their committee to be a subject that called for the interference of Parliament. Mr. Norris talks of frankincense and lime juice. When surgeons tell you the slaves are stowed so close that there is not room to tread among them, and when you have it in evidence from Sir George Young that even in a ship which wanted 200 of her complement, the stench was intolerable. The song and the dance, says Mr. Norris, are promoted. It had been more fair, perhaps, if he had explained that word, promoted. The truth is that for the sake of exercise, these miserable wretches, loaded with chains, oppressed with disease and wretchedness, are forced to dance by the terror of the lash, and sometimes by the actual use of it. Such, then, is the meaning of the word promoted. And it may be observed, too, with respect to food, that an instrument is sometimes carried out in order to force them to eat, which is the same sort of proof how much they enjoy themselves in that instance also. As to their singing, what shall we say when we are told that their songs are songs of lamentation upon their departure, which, while they sing, are always in tears, insomuch that one captain, more humane, as I should conceive him therefore than the rest, threatened one of the women with a flogging, because the mournfulness of her song was too painful for his feelings.
So if you get that piece there, what he's saying was the counter to everything that the previous Norris person was saying. That Norris person was giving like the pro-slavery argument of how well they're treated, and this person was giving the rebuttal of saying like, no, they aren't treated well. They're flogged. Flogging means like they're whipped to dance. They have to be force-fed. They can't. There's no room to walk among them. And obviously, you know, if you're in a bottom of a ship where people are sick, you don't only have human waste, right? People are still going to the bathroom, and the spot where they're laying down in, people are sick, they're throwing up in that same spot. And on top of that, it's so hot, that smell reverberates and they perspire. So it just is. And then, of course, with all the waste that's there and it's not being cleaned, they are then in it, which means diseases fester. So we'll continue talking about the middle passage in our next lesson of how in the world they were able to survive, but we know they did. We will continue that in the next lesson. All right. Thank you, fifth grade. Have a great day.